The gunshot echoed across the desolate plains of Wyoming Territory, 1875, as Forrest Fletcher aimed his revolver at the ground, creating a cloud of dust that billowed around his worn leather boots. His weathered face, permanently etched with the harsh lines of a man who'd seen too much, remained expressionless even as blood seeped through the makeshift bandage on his side. "Move along," he growled at the young man cowering before him, "and don't let me catch you cheating at cards again." The frightened gambler scrambled to his feet and disappeared into the night, leaving Forrest alone outside the saloon in the small town of Redemption Creek. The wound in his side, courtesy of a knife fight 3 towns back, burned like hellfire, but he'd known worse pain. Physical wounds always healed. It was the other kind that festered. He staggered slightly as he holstered his gun, the loss of blood making him dizzy. The wooden porch of the saloon suddenly seemed miles away, and as he took a step toward it, the world tilted dangerously. "Sir, are you all right?" The voice came from his left, soft, concerned, and distinctly female. Forrest turned to see a woman standing a few feet away, clutching a basket of supplies. Her chestnut hair was pulled back in a practical bun, though a few tendrils had escaped to frame a face that reminded him of those painted angels in church windows. "I'm fine," he answered gruffly, even as he felt warm blood trickle down his side. The woman stepped closer, her eyes widening as she noticed the dark stains spreading across his shirt. "You're injured. Let me help you." "No," the word came out harsher than he'd intended. "I don't need your help, madam." "Everyone needs help sometimes," she replied, undeterred. "My name is Clara Prescott. I'm the town schoolteacher, but I've some experience with treating wounds." Forrest wanted to refuse again, to mount his horse and ride away as he always did, but his legs betrayed him, buckling beneath his weight. He would have crashed to the ground if not for Clara's surprisingly strong grip steadying him. "You're coming with me," she said with quiet authority. "My home is just down the street. I'll tend to that wound before you bleed to death out of sheer stubbornness." Too weak to argue, Forrest allowed himself to be led through the darkened streets, acutely aware of her small hand supporting his weight and the faint scent of lavender that clung to her clothes. "I don't deserve your kindness," he muttered as they reached a small, tidy cottage at the edge of town. Clara paused at the door, looking up at him with eyes that seemed to see straight through to his soul. "Then I'll be kind enough for both of us," she replied simply, and pushed the door open. Inside, the cottage was warm and inviting, so different from the cold, empty places Forrest had known for years. Clara helped him to a chair and moved with efficient grace as she gathered supplies: clean cloths, a basin of water, a bottle of whiskey, and a small sewing kit. "Remove your shirt," she instructed, her tone professional despite the blush that crept across her cheeks. Forrest complied wordlessly, wincing as the dried blood pulled at his skin. The knife wound wasn't deep, but it was angry and inflamed. "How long have you been riding with this?" Clara asked, her brow furrowed in concern as she examined the wound. 3 days, he answered, watching as she soaked a cloth in water and began cleaning away the blood and dirt. 3 days, she repeated, shaking her head. "You're lucky it hasn't mortally infected you." Her touch was gentle but sure as she worked, first cleaning the wound, then pouring whiskey over it, which drew a sharp hiss from between Forrest's clenched teeth, and finally stitching the gash closed with neat, tiny sutures. "There," she said, tying off the last stitch. "Keep it clean and those stitches should hold." Forrest looked down at her handiwork, then up at her face, still closed to his as she inspected her work. "Why would you help a stranger like this?" Clara sat back, wiping her hands on a cloth. "Because you needed it," she said simply. "I don't need to know your name or your story to see that you're hurting." "Forrest," he found himself saying. "Forrest Fletcher." "Well, Mr. Fletcher, you'll be staying here tonight. That chair pulls out into a bed, and I won't have you opening those stitches by trying to make it to the inn." He wanted to protest, to tell her that men like him didn't belong in places like this, surrounded by doilies and the smell of fresh bread. But exhaustion was pulling at him, dragging him down into darkness, and the last thing he saw before his eyes closed was Clara Prescott's concerned face, framed by those escaped tendrils of chestnut hair. When Forrest awoke, sunlight was streaming through lace curtains, casting dappled patterns on the wooden floor. For a moment, disoriented by the unfamiliar surroundings, his hand moved instinctively to the gun that wasn't there. "I put your weapon on the table," came Clara's voice. She stood in the doorway, already dressed in a simple blue dress, her hair neatly pinned. I hope you don't mind. It seemed unwise to let an unconscious man sleep with a loaded revolver. Forrest grunted in acknowledgement, the events of the previous night coming back to him. He moved to sit up and was surprised to find the pain in his side had dulled to a manageable throb. How do you feel? Clara asked, moving to pour him a cup of coffee from the pot on the stove. Better than I deserve, he answered truthfully, accepting the cup with a nod of thanks. There you go again, she said with a small smile. You seem determined to believe you're unworthy of basic human kindness. Forrest's weathered face remained impassive, but her words struck closer to home than he liked. You don't know me, Miss Prescott. You don't know what I've done. Perhaps not, she agreed, setting a plate of eggs and toast before him. But I know what you did last night. You could have shot that young man outside the saloon, but you fired into the dirt instead. He frowned, surprised she had witnessed that. Man needed a scare, not a bullet. Precisely my point, Clara said, sitting across from him with her own cup of coffee. Not exactly the actions of someone undeserving of kindness. Forrest didn't know how to respond to that, so he focused on the food instead. It had been a long time since he'd eaten a home-cooked meal, and he was surprised by how hungry he was. I need to go to the schoolhouse soon, Clara said after a moment. The children will be waiting. You're welcome to rest here today. Those stitches need time to do their work. I should move on, Forrest replied automatically. Staying in one place too long was dangerous for him and for anyone who showed him kindness. Clara's expression grew serious. Mr. Fletcher, if you try to ride today, you'll tear those stitches and be back where you started, or worse. I'm asking you to stay, at least for today. Something in her voice, the quiet authority perhaps, or the genuine concern made Forrest nod reluctantly. One day, he conceded. She smiled then, a radiant thing that transformed her already pretty face into something that made Forrest's chest tighten unexpectedly. Thank you, she said, rising to collect her teaching materials. There's more coffee in the pot and stew in the covered pot for lunch. I'll be back in the afternoon. After she left, Forrest sat in the stillness of the cottage, feeling strangely out of place among the little touches that made the house a home, the pressed flowers framed on the wall, the carefully mended cushions, the small collection of books. It had been years since he'd spent time in a real home, not just saloons and rented rooms and camps under the stars. Against his better judgment, he found himself looking at the books on her shelf, volumes of poetry, histories, novels, and a well-worn Bible. He ran his finger along the spines, wondering what worlds Clara escaped to when the day's teaching was done. Later, as promised, he sampled the stew and found it hearty and flavorful. Then, restless despite his injury, he set about making himself useful. He mended a loose floorboard he'd noticed earlier, fixed the squeaky hinge on the back door, and even chopped some kindling for the stove, careful not to strain his injured side. When Clara returned in the late afternoon, she stopped short at the sight of Forrest stacking neatly cut wood by the stove. "What are you doing?" she asked, setting down her books. "Earning my keep," he replied simply. Clara shook her head, a smile playing at her lips. "You were supposed to be resting." "I don't rest well." He straightened up, noting with satisfaction that the stitches held. "I can see that," she said, her eyes taking in the other small repairs around the cottage. "Thank you, that floorboard has been driving me mad for months." They fell into an oddly comfortable rhythm that evening. Clara graded papers at the table while Forrest cleaned his gun and tended to his few possessions. They shared a simple dinner, and Forrest found himself telling her about the wild horses he'd seen on the plains the week before, the way they moved like living thunder across the land. "You have a way with words for a man of so few," Clara observed, her eyes bright with interest. Forrest shifted uncomfortably under her gaze. "Just saying what I saw. Sometimes that's all poetry is," she replied, truly seeing the world and finding the words to share that vision. The night passed peacefully, and when morning came, Forrest knew he should leave. The wound was healing well, and staying longer would only complicate things. Men like him didn't get to have quiet evenings by the fire with schoolteachers who quoted poetry and believed in second chances. "I'll be moving on today," he announced as they finished breakfast. Clara looked up from her plate, disappointment flashing across her face before she composed herself. "If you feel strong enough," she said carefully. "Though I wish you'd stay another day just to be sure. I've imposed enough," he said gruffly. "It wasn't an imposition," Clara replied. "It was nice having company." Something in her voice made Forrest look at her more closely. Behind the confident, capable exterior, he glimpsed a loneliness that mirrored his own. How long had she been alone in this little cottage, teaching other people's children by day and coming home to empty rooms at night? "I should check your stitches before you go," she said, breaking the moment. "Make sure they're holding well." Forrest nodded, removing his shirt with less discomfort than the previous day. Clara's fingers were cool against his skin as she examined the wound, and he was acutely aware of her closeness, the scent of lavender, the soft sound of her breathing. "It's healing nicely," she pronounced, stepping back. "But you still need to be careful." "I will," he promised. As he prepared to leave, gathering his meager belongings and checking his horse, which Clara had arranged to be brought from the livery stable, Forrest found himself reluctant to go. It was a dangerous feeling, one he quickly tried to quash. "Thank you," he said stiffly, standing by his saddled horse. "For everything." Clara smiled up at him, shielding her eyes from the morning sun. "You're welcome, Mr. Fletcher. Perhaps if your travels bring you back this way." "Perhaps," he echoed, though they both knew how unlikely that was. With a final nod, Forrest mounted his horse and rode away, not allowing himself to look back at the small cottage or the woman standing in its doorway. It was better this way, he told himself. Better for her, certainly. Clara Prescott deserved more than a broken-down gunslinger with too many ghosts and not enough future. But as the miles stretched between them, Forrest found himself remembering the warmth of her home, the quiet conversations, and those simple words that had somehow reached something long buried inside him. "Then I'll be kind enough for both of us." 3 weeks later, Forrest sat in a saloon in a nameless town 50 miles west of Redemption Creek, nursing a whiskey and ignoring the raucous card game in the corner. His side had healed well, leaving only a thin scar to join the collection that mapped his hard life across his body. He'd tried to put Clara Prescott out of his mind, but she lingered there like a half-remembered dream. Sometimes at night, he'd wake up thinking he smelled lavender, only to find himself alone under cold stars or in some dingy room. "Fletcher," a voice interrupted his thoughts. Forrest looked up to see a man he vaguely recognized, a horse trader he'd done business with once or twice. "Thompson," Forrest acknowledged with a nod. "Heard you might be looking for work," Thompson said, sliding into the chair across from him. "Got a string of horses need breaking before winter sets in. Pays fair." Forrest considered the offer. Breaking horses was honest work, far from the gun-for-hire jobs he'd taken in recent years. Work that wouldn't add to the weight of regret he carried. "Where's the job?" he asked. "Ranch outside Redemption Creek," Thompson replied. Forrest's hand tightened imperceptibly around his glass. Redemption Creek, where Clara was. "Not interested," he said flatly. Thompson raised an eyebrow. "Pays good, Fletcher, and word is you've got away with the wild ones." "Got business elsewhere," Forrest lied. "Suit yourself," Thompson shrugged, rising. "Offer stands if you change your mind. I'm heading back tomorrow." After Thompson left, Forrest ordered another whiskey, trying to drown the unwelcome hope that had flared at the mention of Redemption Creek. It was foolish. What did he think would happen if he returned? That Clara would welcome him with open arms, that he could somehow fit into her orderly, respectable life. But as the night wore on, Forrest found himself remembering not just Clara, but how he'd felt in her presence, like maybe the man he used to be, before the war and all that came after, wasn't entirely gone by dawn. He'd made his decision. He would take the job, but he'd keep his distance from Clara Prescott. He'd do his work, earn his pay, and move on when it was finished. No complications. The journey back to Redemption Creek took 2 days, riding alongside Thompson and his small party. The familiar landscape brought mixed emotions for Forrest, a strange sense of homecoming mingled with trepidation. The ranch where he'd be working lay 5 miles outside town, close enough that he might encounter Clara, but far enough that he could reasonably avoid it if he chose to. Thompson introduced him to the ranch owner, a gruff widower named Harlan Wilson, who looked Forrest over with a critical eye before nodding his approval. "Got 20 head need breaking," Wilson explained as he showed Forrest to the small cabin where he'd be staying. "Some are wilder than others." Take your time with them, I want them gentled proper, not just broken. Yes, sir, Forrest replied, appreciating the man's approach. Too many ranchers wanted horses broken quickly, regardless of the damage done to the animal's spirit. Town's 5 miles east if you need supplies, Wilson added. We take meals in the main house, breakfast at dawn, supper at dusk. The work began the next day, and Forrest found himself grateful for the physical challenge. Working with horses had always centered him, requiring a presence of mind and body that left little room for dwelling on the past or worrying about the future. The first week passed without incident. Forrest kept to himself, eating meals with the ranch hands but retiring early to his cabin, avoiding their invitations to join them in town on Saturday night. He told himself he was just focused on the job, but the truth was he feared running into Clara. What would he say to her? How would he explain his return without revealing the pull she had on him? But fate, it seemed, had other plans. 10 days after his arrival, Forrest was working with a particularly spirited bay mare when he heard the sound of an approaching wagon. Glancing up from the corral, he saw a familiar figure driving a small buggy up the ranch's main road. Clara Prescott, wearing a simple green dress and the same practical bun, looked as lovely as he remembered. She hadn't seen him yet, her attention focused on guiding the horse toward the main house. Forrest's first instinct was to retreat to the far side of the corral, to hide until she left. But the mare chose that moment to test his authority, sidling aggressively, and he was forced to refocus on the task at hand. By the time he had the horse settled, Clara was already walking back toward her buggy, a basket over her arm. She paused when she saw him, recognition dawning on her face like the sunrise. "Mr. Fletcher," she called, changing course to approach the corral. Forrest removed his hat, suddenly aware of his sweat-soaked shirt and dusty appearance. "Miss Prescott," he acknowledged. "What a surprise," she said, reaching the fence. Her smile seemed genuine, lighting up her face. "I had no idea you were working for Mr. Wilson." "Recent arrangement," he explained, patting the mare's neck to keep her calm. "Breaking horses for the season." "I see," Clara nodded. "I come out once a week to bring books for Mr. Wilson's grandchildren and check on their lessons. They live too far to attend the school regularly." Forrest nodded, unsure what to say next. The mare, sensing his distraction, tossed her head restlessly. "She's beautiful," Clara commented, studying the horse. "Spirited, though, I imagine." "Just needs to learn trust," Forrest replied. "Most wild things do." Clara's eyes met his, and something unspoken passed between them. "Yes," she agreed softly. "They do." An awkward silence stretched between them before Clara straightened, adjusting her basket. "Well, I should be getting back to town. I have lessons to prepare." "Of course," Forrest said, settling his hat back on his head. Clara hesitated, then added, "I'm glad to see you looking well, Mr. Fletcher. Your wound has healed nicely, I trust." "It has," he confirmed. "Thanks to your care." She smiled again, a hint of color touching her cheeks. "Good day to you, then." As she walked away, Forrest found himself calling after her. "Miss Prescott," she turned back, expectant. "It's good to see you again," he said simply. The brightness of her smile stayed with him long after she'd driven away. That night, lying on his narrow bunk in the cabin, Forrest stared at the ceiling and admitted to himself what he'd been denying for weeks. He had feelings for Clara Prescott. Feelings he had no right to harbor, given his past and her future. The sensible thing would be to finish the job quickly and move on. But even as he resolved to do just that, he knew he was lying to himself. The truth was, he wanted to see her again, to hear her voice, to exist in the warmth of her presence for as long as he could. The opportunity came sooner than expected. The following afternoon, as Forrest was working with a skittish colt, Wilson approached the corral. "Fletcher," the rancher called, "need a favor. My regular hand who takes supplies into town is down with a fever. Need someone to deliver these goods to the general store and pick up an order that's waiting. Can you handle it?" Forrest hesitated only briefly before nodding. "Yes, sir, I can do that." An hour later, he was driving a wagon loaded with wool and hides into Redemption Creek, his thoughts inevitably turning to Clara. Would he see her? Part of him hoped so, while another part dreaded the encounter. The general store was busy when he arrived, and Forrest went about his business quietly, arranging the delivery and picking up Wilson's order. As he was loading the last of the supplies into the wagon, a familiar voice called his name. Mr. Fletcher, what a coincidence. He turned to find Clara standing there, a small parcel in her hands, her cheeks flushed from the cool autumn air. Miss Prescott, he greeted her, removing his hat. Twice in 2 days, she said with a smile. Are you running errands for Mr. Wilson? Forrest nodded. His regular man is ill. I see, are you? She hesitated, then pressed on. Are you planning to stay in the area for long? The question caught him off guard, and he found himself answering truthfully instead of with his usual evasion. Depends on how long the work lasts. Winter's coming. Might be wise to find somewhere to wait it out. Clara's face brightened. Redemption Creek is lovely in winter, quiet but lovely. Forrest found himself wanting to continue the conversation, to ask about her work, her life in the month since he'd last seen her. But they were standing in the middle of the street, and people were beginning to take notice of the schoolteacher talking to the rough-looking cowboy. I should get these supplies back to the ranch, he said reluctantly. Of course, Clara replied, but perhaps. Well, I'm hosting a small gathering at my home this Sunday afternoon. A harvest tea, nothing fancy, just a few friends and some of the parents from school. She took a breath, then added quickly, You would be welcome to attend if you'd like. Forrest stared at her, momentarily speechless. A social gathering, the idea was almost laughable. I don't think that would be wise, he said finally. Disappointment flickered across Clara's face before she masked it with a polite smile. Of course, it was just a thought. It's not that I don't want to, Forrest found himself explaining. But I'm not much for socializing, and your friends might wonder. What I'm doing inviting a horsebreaker to tea, Clara finished for him, a hint of challenge in her voice. Mr. Fletcher, I invite whom I please to my home, but I understand if you're uncomfortable. Forrest shifted, suddenly feeling as though he'd offended her. It's not that, it's all right, she interrupted gently. The invitation stands should you change your mind. 3 o'clock Sunday. With a small nod, she continued on her way, leaving Forrest to watch her go with a mixture of regret and relief. The next few days passed in a blur of work, but Forrest couldn't get Clara's invitation out of his mind. The thought of sitting in a parlor making small talk with respectable townsfolk made his skin crawl. And yet, the disappointment in Clara's eyes when he declined haunted him. By Sunday morning, he still hadn't decided what to do. He worked through the early hours, then found himself standing in front of the small mirror in his cabin, studying his reflection critically. His hair was too long, his beard unkempt. Even if he wanted to attend Clara's gathering, he hardly looked the part. With a frustrated growl, he turned away from the mirror. This was foolish. He was a fool for even considering it. And yet, before he could talk himself out of it, Forrest strode to the ranch house and asked Wilson if he could borrow a razor. An hour later, clean-shaven, and with his hair trimmed as best he could manage, he saddled his horse and rode toward town, ignoring the voice in his head telling him this was a mistake. He arrived at Clara's cottage just as the town clock struck 3. Several horses and a buggy were already tied outside, and through the windows he could see figures moving about inside. For a moment Forrest sat on his horse, considering turning around and riding away. But then the door opened and Clara stepped out, as if she'd somehow sensed his presence. She wore a dress the color of autumn leaves, her hair arranged in a more elaborate style than usual, with a few curls framing her face. Mr. Fletcher, she called, surprise and pleasure evident in her voice. You came. There was no turning back now. Forrest dismounted and tied his horse beside the others, feeling oddly exposed without the beard he'd worn for years. Hope I'm not too late, he said gruffly. Not at all, Clara assured him, her eyes taking in his changed appearance. You look different. Figured a beard might not be appropriate for tea, he replied, attempting a small joke. Clara's smile widened. It suits you, both ways, actually. She extended her hand, a gesture that seemed both an invitation and a lifeline. Come in, I'll introduce you. Taking a deep breath, Forrest accepted her hand and allowed himself to be led into the lion's den. To his surprise, the gathering wasn't as uncomfortable as he'd feared. There were about a dozen people present, the local doctor and his wife, a few parents of Clara's students, the minister and his spouse, and several other respectable townsfolk. They seemed more curious than judgmental about his presence, and Clara smoothly introduced him as an old friend who's working at the Wilson Ranch. The conversation flowed around topics Forrest knew little about: town affairs, school matters, church events, but no one seemed to expect him to contribute much. He was content to sit quietly, sipping the surprisingly palatable tea and observing Clara in her element. She was animated and gracious, making sure everyone felt included, their cups full, their plates never empty. Occasionally, her eyes would find his across the room, and she would offer a small, private smile that made him feel as though they shared a secret. It was during one of these moments that Forrest realized with startling clarity that he was falling in love with Clara Prescott. The thought should have sent him running for the hills. Instead, it settled in his chest like a warm coal, both comforting and dangerous. As the gathering began to disperse in the early evening, Forrest found himself lingering, helping Clara clear away cups and plates while the last guests said their goodbyes. "You didn't have to stay and help," Clara said as the door closed behind the minister and his wife. "Seemed the proper thing to do," Forrest replied, carrying a stack of plates to the kitchen. "Well, I appreciate it," she smiled. "Did you survive the afternoon?" "Barely," he said, the corner of his mouth lifting in the closest thing to a smile she'd seen from him. Clara laughed, a bright, clear sound that made something loosen in Forrest's chest. "They're good people, but I know it can be overwhelming." "You have a nice life here," Forrest observed, looking around the now quiet cottage. "People respect you." "I'm fortunate," Clara agreed. "Though it's not without its challenges. Being a single woman in a small town comes with certain expectations." Forrest nodded, understanding the unspoken. Women alone were always subject to scrutiny, their every move watched for propriety. It occurred to him that by inviting him today, a man with no standing in the community, Clara had risked some of that hard-earned respect. "I should go," he said suddenly. "It's getting late." "Oh," Clara's disappointment was evident. "Yes, I suppose it is." They walked to the door together, an awkward tension descending that hadn't been there before. At the threshold, Forrest turned to her. "Thank you for inviting me," he said formally. "It was nice." "You're welcome anytime, Mr. Fletcher," Clara replied, her voice soft. "Not just for tea parties." Forrest looked down at her, at the gentle curve of her cheek and the expectant light in her eyes, and felt a longing so profound it nearly buckled his knees. In another life, with another man's past, he might have dared to lean down to close the distance between them. Instead, he nodded stiffly. "Good night, Miss Prescott." "Good night," she whispered as he stepped out into the gathering dusk, the word carrying the weight of things unsaid. The ride back to the ranch gave Forrest too much time to think. About Clara, about the way she looked at him, about the foolish hope growing inside him despite his best efforts to stamp it out. By the time he reached his cabin, he'd convinced himself that the kindest thing, the only honorable thing, would be to finish his work and move on before he complicated her life any further. But fate, once again, had other plans. The following Thursday, a cold rain swept in from the north, turning the ranch into a muddy mess and sending everyone indoors for shelter. Forrest was in the stables, checking on the horses, when he heard a commotion from the main house. Moments later, Wilson appeared at the stable door, his face grim. "Fletcher," he called over the sound of rain on the roof. "Need your help. My grandson's taken ill, fever's high and rising. Need to get him to the doctor in town, but the creek's rising fast. Might be impassable soon." Forrest nodded, immediately moving to saddle his horse. "I'll go with you." "No," Wilson shook his head. "Need you to ride ahead, get the doctor to meet us. My daughter's preparing the boy now. We'll follow in the wagon, but a rider can make better time." Without hesitation, Forrest mounted up and rode out into the downpour, pushing his horse as fast as was safe on the slick ground. The creek that lay between the ranch and town was indeed rising rapidly, the usually placid water now a churning, muddy torrent that nearly reached his horse's belly as they forded it. In town, Forrest located the doctor, delivering Wilson's message with urgent brevity. The doctor immediately began gathering his supplies, promising to set out as soon as his buggy was ready. As Forrest turned to leave, intending to ride back and help guide Wilson's wagon, the doctor stopped him. "Wait, son. In this weather, they might need more help than I can give. Stop by the schoolhouse and fetch Miss Prescott. She has nursing experience and assists me with serious cases." Forrest hesitated only a moment before nodding and heading back out into the rain. The schoolhouse stood at the edge of town, a simple wooden building with a bell tower. At this late hour, he expected it to be empty, but a light glowed in one window. Tying his horse under the overhang, Forrest knocked firmly on the door. There was a pause. Then the sound of footsteps, and Clara appeared, surprise registering on her face when she saw him standing there, dripping wet. "Mr. Fletcher, what Wilson's grandson is ill," he cut in. "Doctor asks if you can come, fever's high." Understanding immediately, Clara nodded. "Of course, let me gather a few things." She moved with efficient speed, collecting a shawl and a small bag that seemed prepared for just such emergencies. Within minutes, they were outside again, facing the worsening storm. "I came on horseback," Forrest explained. "Can you ride?" "Yes," Clara assured him, "though it's been some time." Without further discussion, Forrest helped her mount behind him, acutely aware of her arms wrapping around his waist for security as the horse moved forward. The journey back was slow and treacherous, the rain relentless, the creek even higher than before. As they approached the swollen waterway, Forrest felt Clara tense behind him. "Hold tight," he instructed, guiding the horse to what appeared to be the shallowest crossing point. The water surged around them as they entered, the horse fighting against the current. Midway across, the animal lost its footing momentarily, slipping in the muddy streambed. Clara gasped, her arms tightening around Forrest's waist, but he spoke soothingly to the horse, guiding it safely to the far bank. "Are you all right?" he asked as they continued toward the ranch, her body still pressed close against his back. "Yes," she replied, her voice steady despite the ordeal. "Thank you." They arrived at the ranch to find the doctor's buggy already there, the physician having taken a different route. Inside the main house, Wilson's 7-year-old grandson lay burning with fever, his mother, Wilson's daughter, watching anxiously as the doctor examined him. Clara immediately went to work, helping the doctor while providing calm reassurance to the worried family. Forrest stood back, unsure of his place but unwilling to leave. The boy's condition was serious pneumonia, the doctor pronounced, and would require constant care through the night. "The creek's too high now for anyone to cross safely," Wilson informed them grimly. "You'll all have to stay until morning at least," Clara nodded, already rolling up her sleeves. "I'll sit with him through the night," she offered, "if someone can spell me occasionally." "I will," Forrest found himself saying, surprising everyone, including himself. As darkness fell, the household settled into an uneasy vigil. The doctor, exhausted from his own recent cases, accepted Wilson's offer of a bed for a few hours' rest, while Wilson and his daughter took turns sitting with Clara in the sick room. Shortly after midnight, Forrest relieved Wilson, entering the quiet room where Clara sat beside the boy's bed, applying cool compresses to his feverish skin. She looked up as he entered, fatigue evident in the shadows beneath her eyes. "How is he?" Forrest asked quietly, moving to stand beside her. "Fighting," Clara replied. "The fever hasn't broken yet, but he's strong." Forrest nodded, watching as she tenderly brushed the hair from the child's forehead. "You should rest," he said. "I can watch him for a while." Clara hesitated, clearly torn between her duty and her exhaustion. "I'm not sure I know what to do," Forrest assured her. "Keep the compresses cool, give him water if he wakes, call for help if the fever rises or his breathing worsens." Surprise flickered across Clara's face. "You've done this before." "During the war," Forrest confirmed. "And after on the trail, seen my share of fevers." After a moment's consideration, Clara nodded. "All right, just for an hour." She rose from the chair, swaying slightly with fatigue. Instinctively, Forrest reached out to steady her, his hand gentle on her arm. For a moment they stood close, the sleeping child and the storm outside the only sounds in the room. "Thank you," Clara said softly, her eyes meeting his. "For everything today." Forrest nodded, unable to find the right words. She smiled tiredly and left the room, leaving him alone with the sick child. True to his word, Forrest tended the boy carefully, changing compresses and watching for any change in his condition. An hour passed, then two, but Clara didn't return. She had likely succumbed to much-needed sleep. In the quiet of the night, with only a small lamp burning and the sound of rain on the roof, Forrest found himself speaking softly to the unconscious child. "You'll be all right, boy," he murmured, adjusting the blanket. "Got good people looking after you. Your grandpa, your ma, that doctor. And Miss Prescott, she's something special, that one. The kind that makes you believe in good things again, even when you thought that part of you was long dead." He fell silent, surprised by his own candor. Perhaps it was the intimacy of the sick room, the vulnerability of the child, or simply the culmination of feelings he'd been suppressing for weeks. "Mr. Fletcher," Clara's voice from the doorway startled him. How long had she been standing there? How much had she heard? Her expression, a mixture of surprise and something softer, suggested she'd heard enough. "Thought you were resting," he said gruffly, embarrassed. "I was," she replied, moving into the room, "but I couldn't sleep knowing he was ill." She came to stand beside him, looking down at the child, whose breathing seemed a little easier than before. Their shoulders were almost touching, and Forrest was acutely aware of her presence, the scent of lavender somehow persisting despite the long day. "What you said just now." Clara began hesitantly. "Didn't say anything important," Forrest interrupted, uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation. Clara turned to face him fully, her expression determined despite her evident fatigue. "It was important to me," she said quietly. They were standing very close now, the sleeping child and the storm creating a cocoon of privacy around them. Forrest looked down at her face, illuminated by the soft lamplight, and felt the walls he'd built around his heart beginning to crumble. "Clara," he said, her given name crossing his lips for the first time, "I'm not a good man." "I disagree," she replied simply. "I've seen enough of you to know better." "You've seen what I've allowed you to see," he countered. "There's more, things I've done, things I can't undo." "We all have regrets," Clara said, her gaze unwavering. "The question is whether we let them define us forever." Forrest shook his head, both frustrated and moved by her persistent faith in him. "Why do you care? Why bother with a broken-down cowboy with nothing to offer?" "Because," Clara said, reaching up to touch his cheek gently, "I see the man you could be, the man you are, beneath all that armor, and because I believe I'm falling in love with that man." Her words hung in the air between them, honest and vulnerable and terrifying. Forrest stood frozen, a war raging inside him between the part that wanted to run far and fast and the part that wanted to pull her close and never let go. Before he could respond, a small sound from the bed drew their attention. The boy was stirring, his eyes fluttering open. Clara immediately moved to his side, her hand going to his forehead. "The fever's breaking," she announced with relief, effectively ending their conversation. The rest of the night passed in a blur of activity, the doctor being woken, the mother's tearful relief, the gradual improvement of the child's condition. By dawn, the crisis had passed, and the boy was sleeping peacefully, his body cooler to the touch. Outside, the rain had stopped, though the creek remained high. Forrest stood on the porch, watching the sunrise paint the wet landscape in golden hues, his mind churning with Clara's confession and his own conflicted feelings. He heard the door open behind him but didn't turn, knowing who it would be. Clara came to stand beside him, wrapped in a borrowed shawl, her hair falling loose around her shoulders. "The doctor says Tommy will recover fully," she said. "Children are remarkably resilient." Forrest nodded, unsure how to navigate the new territory between them after the night's revelations. "About what I said earlier," Clara began. "You were tired," Forrest interrupted. "Caught up in the moment, you don't have to explain." Clara's expression hardened slightly. "Don't do that. Don't dismiss my feelings as though they're some momentary fancy or delusion." "Then don't blind yourself to reality," Forrest countered, frustration leaking into his voice. "You're respected here, you have a life, a future. I'm just passing through, same as I've been doing for years." "Is that what you want?" Clara challenged. "To keep passing through, never staying anywhere long enough to put down roots? Never allowing yourself to care or be cared for?" Her words hit too close to home, cutting through the defenses he'd relied on for so long. "What I want doesn't matter," he said finally. "It's about what's right. And you get to decide that for both of us," Clara asked, her voice rising slightly before she caught herself, mindful of the household behind them. "That's remarkably presumptuous, Mr. Fletcher." The formality stung, a deliberate step back from the intimacy of Forrest and Clara that they had briefly shared. "I'm trying to protect you," he insisted. "From what?" Clara demanded. "From gossip, from a difficult path. I'm stronger than you think, or is it yourself you're really protecting?" Forrest turned to face her fully, struck by the perception in her question. Was she right? Was he using her welfare as an excuse to protect himself from the vulnerability of caring too deeply? Before he could formulate a response, the door opened again, and Wilson appeared. Creek's going down, the rancher announced. Doctor says it'll be safe to cross in an hour or so. Clara nodded, her eyes still on Forrest. Thank you, Mr. Wilson. I should help get Tommy settled before we leave. She went back inside without another word, leaving Forrest alone with his thoughts and the dawning realization that he was at a crossroads. He could continue on the solitary path he'd walked for years, or he could risk everything for the chance at something he'd convinced himself he didn't deserve: a home, a future, love. The journey back to town later that morning was subdued. Forrest rode alongside the doctor's buggy, which carried both the physician and Clara. The creek, while still higher than normal, was passable, and they crossed without incident. In town, Clara thanked the doctor and turned to Forrest, her manner polite but distant. Thank you for your assistance yesterday, Mr. Fletcher. Tommy might not have survived without your help. Just did what needed doing, Forrest replied, uncomfortable with the formality between them. Clara nodded, then hesitated, as if weighing her next words carefully. I meant what I said last night, she said finally, all of it, but I won't chase after someone who's determined to run. Good day. With that, she turned and walked away, her back straight despite her evident fatigue. Forrest watched her go, a hollow feeling spreading in his chest. He'd gotten what he thought he wanted. She was letting him go, so why did it feel like he was losing something precious? The next week passed in a haze of work and sleepless nights. Forrest threw himself into breaking horses with a single-minded determination that even Wilson commented on. By day, he exhausted himself with physical labor. By night, he lay awake, Clara's words echoing in his mind. On Saturday, he rode into town for supplies, deliberately timing his visit to avoid the hours when Clara would likely be about. He completed his business quickly and was preparing to leave when he overheard a conversation that stopped him cold. Heard Miss Prescott got an offer from that school back east, a man was saying to his companion outside the general store. The one her cousin teaches at. Wouldn't surprise me, the other man replied. She's wasted here teaching farm kids their letters. She's educated, that one, could do better for herself. Town would miss her, though, not many willing to take on a teaching post out here. Forrest moved away, their words ringing in his ears. Clara leaving? The possibility had never occurred to him. In his mind, she was as fixed a part of Redemption Creek as the church steeple or the general store. The thought of her gone, not just from his life, but from this place, entirely created a panic he hadn't expected. Without conscious decision, he found himself riding toward her cottage. It was mid-afternoon, and smoke rose from the chimney, indicating she was home. For several long minutes, Forrest sat on his horse, debating whether to approach or ride away. Finally, gathering his courage, he dismounted and knocked on her door. There was a pause, then footsteps, and Clara appeared, surprise evident on her face when she saw him. Mr. Fletcher, she greeted him, her tone cautious. Miss Prescott, he replied, removing his hat. May I speak with you? After a moment's hesitation, she nodded and stepped back, allowing him to enter. The cottage was as welcoming as he remembered, a fire burning in the hearth, books stacked on the table. What can I do for you? Clara asked, maintaining a careful distance. Forrest struggled to find the right words, the speech he'd rehearsed on the ride over suddenly inadequate. I heard, there's talk you might be leaving, going east to teach. Clara's eyebrows rose slightly. News travels fast in small towns, she observed. Yes, I've received an offer from a girls' school in Boston. My cousin teaches there and recommended me to the headmistress. Are you going to accept? Forrest asked, his mouth dry. Clara studied him for a moment, her expression unreadable. I'm considering it, she said finally. There's little to keep me here. The words and the pointed look that accompanied them made Forrest's chest tighten. What about your students? The town needs you. They'll find another teacher, Clara replied. Perhaps not one who cares as much, but someone who can teach the basics. Clara, Forrest said, abandoning formality, don't go. She looked at him steadily. Give me one good reason to stay. It was a direct challenge, one that cut through all the pretense and self-deception. Forrest took a deep breath, knowing he was about to leap off a cliff with no guarantee of what lay below. Me, he said simply. Stay for me. Clara's expression softened, but she didn't rush to respond. The last time we spoke, you were quite adamant that there could be nothing between us. What's changed? Nothing, everything. Forrest ran a hand through his hair, frustration evident. The thought of you leaving. It made me realize I've been a fool. a proud, stubborn fool who was so busy protecting himself from hurt that he couldn't see the gift right in front of him. Clara moved closer, hope beginning to bloom in her eyes. "And what gift is that?" "You," Forrest replied, his voice rough with emotion. "Your kindness, your belief in me even when I didn't deserve it." "You've always deserved kindness, Forrest," Clara said softly. "Everyone does. But especially you." Forrest shook his head, still struggling with the concept. "I've done things, Clara, during the war and after, things that haunt me." "I know," she replied. "Or at least I can imagine. War changes men. Life on the frontier changes them too. But the past doesn't define who you can become." She was standing very close now, close enough that he could see the flecks of gold in her brown eyes, smell the lavender that always seemed to surround her. "I can't promise I'll be good at this," Forrest admitted. "Being with someone. Staying in one place. I've been alone for a long time." "Then I'll be patient enough for both of us," Clara replied, echoing her words from that first night. "If you're willing to try." In that moment, looking into her hopeful face, Forrest made his decision. With gentleness that belied his rough exterior, he reached out to touch her cheek, then leaned down to press his lips to hers in a kiss that was both a promise and a new beginning. When they parted, Clara was smiling, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "Does this mean you'll stay in Redemption Creek?" she asked. "As long as you'll have me," Forrest replied, realizing as he said it that he meant every word. "That might be a very long time, Mr. Fletcher," Clara warned, her smile widening. "I'm counting on it, Miss Prescott," he responded, drawing her close again. The months that followed brought changes both gradual and profound. Forrest completed his work at the Wilson Ranch, then accepted a position as the livery stable manager in town when the previous owner decided to retire. The work suited him, honest labor that utilized his way with horses while keeping him close to Clara. Their courtship raised eyebrows, at first the refined schoolteacher and the rough-edged former drifter, but as winter melted into spring, the townsfolk gradually accepted the match. It helped that Forrest proved himself reliable and hardworking, and that the changes in him were evident to anyone who cared to look the way he stood straighter, smiled more readily, participated in community affairs with increasing comfort. For Clara's part, she declined the position in Boston with no regrets, finding her work in Redemption Creek more fulfilling than ever, especially with Forrest's steady presence in her life. In the evenings, they would often sit by the fire in her cottage, Clara reading aloud from her favorite books while Forrest listened, occasionally offering insights that revealed the keen mind beneath his taciturn exterior. It was on such an evening, as spring bloomed into early summer, that Forrest finally shared the full story of his service in the Union Army, the horrors he'd witnessed, the years after spent drifting from town to town, taking whatever work he could find, sometimes straying into lawlessness when desperation took hold. "There was a time," he admitted, staring into the fire rather than meeting her eyes, "when I hired out my gun. Never killed anyone who didn't deserve it, at least by the standards of the frontier, but those aren't God's standards, or yours." Clara listened without judgment, her hand steady in his. "The man who did those things," she said when he'd finished, "is not the man sitting beside me now. You've changed, Forrest. You continue to change." "Because of you," he replied, finally looking at her. "You saw something in me I couldn't see in myself." "No," Clara corrected gently. "I simply reminded you of what was already there, buried beneath pain and regret. The rest you did yourself by choosing a different path." Their wedding took place in late summer, a simple ceremony in the small church with Wilson as Forrest's best man and Clara's cousin from Boston as her matron of honor. The entire town turned out, a testament to how fully Forrest had been accepted into the community he once would have merely passed through. As they spoke their vows, Forrest looked into Clara's radiant face and marveled at the journey that had brought him to this moment, from a wounded, solitary drifter to a man with a home, a purpose, and a love he would have once believed impossible. "I, Forrest, take you, Clara, to be my lawfully wedded wife," he spoke clearly, his voice steady. "To have and to hold from this day forward, for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, till death do us part." Clara's eyes shone with happy tears as she repeated the vows, her hand warm in his, her belief in him unwavering. Later, at the small reception held in the schoolyard, as neighbors and friends celebrated around them, Forrest pulled his new wife aside for a moment of privacy. "Happy?" he asked, his arm around her waist. "Completely," Clara assured him, leaning into his embrace. "And you?" Forrest looked around at the community that had become his home, then back at the woman who had made it all possible. "More than I ever thought I could be," he admitted. "More than I deserve." Clara shook her head, a familiar determination in her eyes. "There you go again, Mr. Fletcher," she chided gently. "When will you accept that you deserve every happiness?" "Maybe never," Forrest replied honestly, "but I promise to keep trying every day to be worthy of you." "And I promise," Clara responded, rising on tiptoes to kiss him, "to be kind enough for both of us whenever you forget." In the years that followed, Redemption Creek watched as the unlikely couple built a life together, Forrest eventually purchasing the livery outright, Clara continuing to teach while also starting a small library in a corner of the schoolhouse. They moved from her cottage to a modest house at the edge of town, with enough land for Forrest to keep a few horses of his own, and for Clara to plant the garden she'd always wanted. Children came first: a son, sturdy and serious like his father but with his mother's thoughtful eyes, then a daughter with Clara's chestnut hair and Forrest's quiet determination. They grew up hearing the story of how their parents met a wounded drifter and a kind schoolteacher who saw beyond his rough exterior to the good man beneath. And if sometimes Forrest still woke in the night, haunted by memories of darker days, Clara was always there, her presence a reminder that the past was just that past, and that the present held all the redemption a man could need. On the 10th anniversary of their wedding, as they sat on the porch of their home watching their children play in the yard, Clara reached over to take Forrest's hand. "Any regrets?" she asked softly. "About staying about us?" Forrest shook his head, squeezing her hand. "Not a single one," he replied truthfully. "You saved me, Clara, in every way a person can be saved." "We saved each other," she corrected gently. "That's what love does." Forrest nodded, watching as their son helped their daughter mount her first pony, his hands steady and sure, his instructions patient. In that moment, seeing his own hard-won kindness reflected in his child, Forrest finally accepted what Clara had been telling him for years, that he was worthy of this life, this love, this happiness. "You were right," he said quietly. Clara turned to him, curious. "About what?" "About being kind enough for both of us," Forrest replied. "You were, until I learned how to be kind to myself." Clara's smile, as bright and healing as it had been on that first night in her cottage, was all the confirmation he needed that the journey from broken to whole, from solitary to connected, from undeserving to worthy had been worth every step. And as the sun set over Redemption Creek, painting the sky in colors as vibrant as their shared life had become, Forrest Fletcher knew with absolute certainty that he was exactly where he was meant to be, beside the woman who had taught him that everyone, even a wayward cowboy with a troubled past, deserved kindness, deserved love, deserved a place to call home.